GSI. Recording in progress. Welcome to the GSI seminar and this lecture of GM 144. Today we are welcoming Simon Sharpe, and Simon Sharpe is the climate champion of the UNFCCC. He's the director of economics there, and he used to work as the deputy director of the COP26 unit for the UK government. So without further ado, floor is up to you.
Right. Yeah, can people hear me enough? Am I loud enough? Yeah, okay, good. All right. Cool, thanks. And my other identity, I feel like, is friend of the family of Exeter GSI. I haven't quite kept count. I don't know if this is number 3 or number 4 annual lecture of this kind. But actually, I've been coming here a lot longer than that. When I first got into climate change, this was one of the first places that I came. And at that time, the reason for coming here first was to talk to Tim Lenton and understand his thinking on tipping points in the climate system. And that was my big focus at first, trying to understand the risks of climate change. And later on, when I got more interested in the economics of the transition and what to do about it, then I met JF and Femke and other people here and realized that Exeter is also a center of really powerful and helpful thinking on that as well. So this is a good place to be, and all of us are lucky to be here. So I'm going to say a few things about economics and diplomacy of climate action. And once I've figured out how the computer works, I will have slides. Yeah, okay. Hooray. So if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, then the rate of decarbonisation of the global economy this decade has to be about 5 times faster than it was over the last 2 decades. That's measured in terms of emissions per unit global GDP. It's got to come down about 8% a year instead of 1.5% a year. Now, there are other ways of looking at those numbers which make it look not so bad, not so impossible, and we'll get to that. But clearly, there's still a significant acceleration of change that has to happen. And my feeling is that won't happen if we keep on doing everything the same. And what I mean by that is, well, this is what the right-hand part of this slide is about. If you want to change the visible stuff in the economy, the buildings and the buses and all of that, you also have to change some of the invisible stuff, the pipelines and the power cables and all of that guts that's under the ground. But I think if we want this really fast acceleration of progress, then we also have to change some invisible infrastructure of ideas and institutions. And so that's what this is about. The reason I talk about this and I write about this is I think these are relatively under-recognized problems, which means they're under-recognized opportunities to make much faster progress. So part 1 is about economics, and this is drawing very heavily on work that we've done together in this project led by Exeter and also involving researchers elsewhere in the UK and in China, India, and Brazil. And the idea of this was, let's take a really hard look at the economics of the transition and see if we can use that to help inform policy. And a general finding of the first report that we did together, where we looked at the biggest successes so far in the low carbon transition in Europe, in China, in India, and Brazil. And when I say successes, I mean things that got clean technology deployed quickly, costs down quickly, jobs created, emissions down. The policies that were central to those successes were generally adopted despite the economic advice and not because of them. And if you realize how central economics is to informing public policy and public debate, then you realize that finding should be really troubling. We don't want economics giving the wrong advice. That will make our job much harder than it needs to be. So why would that be? Well, to me, it all starts from one place, one assumption. The assumption that the economy is in equilibrium, which has been quite a fundamental assumption of the dominant strand of economic thinking for the last 150 years. Equilibrium is defined in the Oxford Dictionary of Economics as a situation in which nobody has any immediate reason to change their actions so that the status quo can continue, at least temporarily. When do we see that situation? Well, or you can ask, when is that a good approximation? And I think it depends on time and space. If you look at the solar system, then it looks like a system in equilibrium, and it might be quite a good approximation to model it that way if you want to know how it's going to be over the next 1,000 years, 100,000 years or more. But if you're looking at it in terms of billions of years, actually it becomes no longer a good approximation. In fact, it's no longer a system in equilibrium. You won't be able to helpfully understand it that way. If you look at the weather, then it's a much shorter timescale. If you say, what's the weather in 5 minutes' time? Well, it's very likely it's the same as it is now. So over that shorter time span, you can approximate it as an equilibrium system. But obviously, if you want a weather forecast for tomorrow or for 3 days' time or 5 days' time, you can't. You have to model it as a dynamic system that has lots of different possible states. Otherwise, your weather model will just tell you that every single day will be a sunny day with no wind and no rain. So the weather's not an equilibrium system. I put in a game of football just because actually, compared to the economy, that's a highly regulated system. The players on the pitch don't change, except for substitutions, but there's the same number of them doing the same jobs. There's only one ball. The goals stay in the same place. That's really quite a fixed system. And yet, when does that system ever settle down to equilibrium? Have you ever seen a football game where nobody had any reason to change their actions? Probably not. It would be a really boring game if you did. That situation never arises. Now think about two competing football clubs. The pitch is not so fixed for them. The market changes, the business changes. It's constantly evolving. You know, the Premier League in the 1990s was a very different thing from what had existed 10 years before. And it's the business strategies of those clubs are constantly evolving. They never encounter a situation where there's no reason to change their actions. So my point of saying this is that equilibrium is a very rare situation, especially in the economy. And it's often unlikely to be a good approximation. Now let's look, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the nature of it? Well, eliminating emissions from the global economy, the IPCC describes it as what's needed is rapid and far-reaching system transitions unprecedented in terms of scale. A system transition is where you replace not only one set of technologies with another, but also everything that fits around those technologies, the infrastructure, the institutions, the business strategies, the investment, the industrial structure, everything else. And you could say, well, a system transition is a situation in which many actors have many reasons to change their actions so that the status quo is replaced with something completely different. It's about as far away from equilibrium as you could get. So why does that matter? What effect does that have? I'll say something first about the role of policy and then about specific policy instruments. First of all, if you think the economy is an equilibrium system, you think it's like a machine. It's static. It might have some moving parts, but the relationships between those parts doesn't change. It's predictable. If you know its starting conditions, you can predict exactly what it's going to do. It's got a limited number of possibilities. And crucially, the role of policy is fix it when it fails. If it fails, you know, you've got to fix it, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So there's a strong bias towards inaction. If the economy is a disequilibrium system, we can't think of it like a machine. We have to think about it more like an ecosystem instead. It's constantly evolving. It's uncertain. It's got effectively unlimited possibilities, and it doesn't function or fail, which means that the role of policy can't be to fix it when it fails. And it must be to steer its evolution in a direction that fits with whatever you think is good for society. So that instead of having a bias towards inaction, in this disequilibrium economy, where inaction is a choice, stuff's all changing around you, doing nothing might not be ideal. So it doesn't have that presumption. Now, going on to, I want to talk about the three main levers of policy. They're not the only ones, but the main ones: investment, regulation, and tax. And first, let's just start with what these influential people are saying. I've got nothing against these people individually. They're all good people, and they're all doing their best. But I think they're wrong. They are still telling people that carbon pricing is the most cost-efficient solution to achieve climate goals. And please, 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 in this, focus on the superlative. They're not just saying it's good. If they were just saying put a price on carbon because that's a good thing to do, I would have no disagreement with them. They're saying it's the best thing to do. And I wonder why. I think they're wrong. And this was last December, by the way. So very recent. And of course, it's not just them saying that individually, they're using the power of their institutions to say that. The IMF, the European Commission, and the WTO, they're all very authoritative. Governments all over the world listen to what they say and sometimes believe them. But where does it come from? Why are they saying that? Well, it goes back to that point of equilibrium. In a state of equilibrium, it's possible to have an optimal allocation of economic resources. You know, everything's fixed, everything's static. You can share everything out in a way that everybody's happy. You know, it's like dividing up a pie. And so you can prove that this state of optimal allocation of resources exists. The idea is that carbon emissions are like pollution. And if the polluter doesn't have to pay for that, then there's a suboptimal allocation of resources. And you can fix that by pricing the pollution. It fixes that market failure and everybody's happy again. Everything's perfect again, perfect allocation of resources. But we've just said our problem of low carbon transitions, they're system transitions by definition. We're talking about the economy in a state of disequilibrium. In that state, then there's no optimal allocation of economic resources that can exist. You can't optimally allocate things that are constantly changing. Nobody's proved there's any such state. So none of the rest of that chain of logic follows. So that means there's absolutely no a priori reason to think that carbon pricing is the best solution. So we should just clear our heads of that, start with a clean sheet. What do we think would work well and why? Just go back to the beginning again. And what do we see happening around us? Well, this is a quote from Stefan Hallegatt and his colleague, who are senior economists at the World Bank. And this was a few years ago now, but it's still true. You look around and you see, well, all of these big successes in renewable power and electric vehicles and batteries and all the rest, all of this was achieved with policies focused on new investments, not with carbon taxes. And when we say all of this, we're talking about quite a lot. And my example here is showing global solar PV deployment over time, and it's showing changing expectations over time. The earliest expectations are at the bottom of the graph, and the later ones go up and up and up. And what you see, if you go back to the beginning, 2006, governments and analysts thought that the world would deploy 50 gigawatts of solar power by 2020. When we got to 2020, the actual number was 714 gigawatts, more by an order of magnitude and then some. So did we do the second best policy, but just get really, really lucky because it was 12 times more effective than we thought it would be? Or actually, did we do the right thing? I think we did the right thing. And it comes down to reinforcing feedbacks, which are well known. Brian Arthur wrote about these several decades ago. When you have new technology in its early phase, when it's being developed and deployed, you get these self-amplifying feedbacks. Learning by doing, the more you make it, the better you get at making it. Economies of scale, the more you make, the cheaper it gets. The emergence of complementary technologies that make it more useful, and the big feedback between investment, innovation, and increasing demand. All of those things are self-amplifying. If you directly invest in the new technologies, you subsidize them, or you use public procurement or some other means of directly investing in those new technologies, you directly strengthen these self-amplifying feedbacks. That's really good. You put some effort in and you get increasing returns on your effort. Early in the transition, if you just put a price on the fossil fuels, what's likely to happen? Well, most likely, you just nudge the existing fossil fuel system to operate slightly more efficiently. That's not a terrible thing, but there's no self-amplification in that. There are no reinforcing feedbacks. So that's less efficient, less dynamically efficient. That's the crucial point. It's nothing to do with political popularity or the political difficulty of carbon pricing. It's about the dynamics of change in the economy. They're fundamentally different. And we can see why investment would be more effective than tax at that stage of the transition. And when you look back at historical examples of all kinds of different technology transitions, then it's not hard to see, and it's not difficult to understand why early in the transition, they tend to be driven by investment in the new solutions, the new technologies and the new systems. That's what really drives them forward. And my rude example is horses to cars was driven by people investing in motors, factories, cars, building roads, writing the highway code, all of that stuff. That's what made the transition happen. It wasn't putting a tax on horseshit. Even though horseshit was an externality. There was a lot of it in cities. It really was a problem. You could make a good case for taxing it, make the polluter pay. But that's not what drove that transition. Of course, when you invest in something to make a transition happen, you're going to have to invest in something. You can't invest in nothing and you can't invest in everything. And that challenges this other widely accepted principle that policy should try to be technology neutral. Actually, in a technology transition, policy can't be technology neutral. You might think you are, but imagine an ecosystem. Imagine if you're trying to intervene in this in a way that's neutral with respect to all of its inhabitants. You can't do it. Even if you do what we're doing now, warm up all the oceans by the same amount, acidify them all by the same amount, dumping CO2 into it, you could say, well, that's a very neutral approach. This is like economy-wide carbon pricing. But does it affect them all the same? No, of course it doesn't. So some species go extinct, others just do a bit worse, and some, like the jellyfish, really love it and think, hooray, our time has come. You can't be neutral with respect to technology in the economy any more than you can with respect to species in an ecosystem. So if you can't be neutral, it suggests that rather than choosing accidentally, you should probably choose deliberately where you can. Another thing to bear in mind as we make that choice is the economy is path dependent, which means our options now depend on choices that were made in the past. And the choices we make now determine the options that are available to us in future. So that means some of these technology choices that might look small could turn out to have really long-lasting consequences that shape the economy for a long time to come. One example of this is 100 years ago, people didn't know what technology to use for cars. And they were thinking about, should it be electric vehicles, which were ahead at one stage? Should it be petrol cars, or should it be steam-powered cars? And they even had races to see which one would be quickest and last the longest and be most reliable and that kind of thing. And of course, they went for petrol cars, and that had an effect not just on the car industry, but also on the oil industry, and also on politics, and also on the global climate. Quite a lot of things. So it's very difficult. I'm not saying we can know what all of these long-term consequences of our choices would be, but I'm saying we should choose carefully. That was all about investment. I'll be a bit quicker talking about regulation. Here, the standard thing is that you don't want to regulate. You have a nice, perfectly optimized economy. Regulation is some ham-fisted intervention that's probably going to distort it and add costs. And the only exception to that is if there's a market failure. But even then, you really don't want to use regulation. You'd much rather use pricing, because that's more efficient. Well, that's the sort of a characterization of the standard view. And people might quite rightly say, well, of course, economics has a more nuanced view than that. Yes, of course it does. But what matters is that this principle that regulation is costly and you should try and minimize it, that's been deeply embedded in a lot of people's thinking. but a lot of politicians, a lot of civil servants, a lot of wider society. And so that is influential, whatever the academic papers say. This piece of work was done by a bunch of people, including one, the name at the end of that list, S. Chu. Stephen Chu used to be Energy Secretary to Barack Obama. Before that, he was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And he wrote 500 papers on physics, and this was his first one on economics. The reason he did this was he wanted to put through tough energy efficiency standards for appliances in America. And as Energy Secretary, that was his priority. And the economists in his own Department of Energy kept putting out impact assessments saying, if we do this, it will push up the prices of these appliances. And of course, that made his job significantly more difficult. There were plenty of people in the US Congress that wanted to oppose what he wanted to do. And he just thought, well, maybe they're wrong. Why don't we look at what the data tells us? And he looked at the data and it told him the opposite, actually what he was expecting. That tough energy efficiency standards for things like fridges, air conditioners, washing machines, they didn't push the prices up, they accelerated the rate of price reduction. So it looked as if those standards did something to accelerate innovation. Why would they do that? Well, again, if we think in dynamic terms, we think in evolutionary terms, we can understand that. The rate of evolution is inversely proportional to the fitness of the population for its current environment. What happens when you regulate is you're saying, inefficient fridges, you're no longer fit for your environment. You can't survive, you can't be profitable. So any firms that are making that, you can't just keep allocating all of your resources to exploiting that position, spending on adverts for inefficient fridges. You have to reallocate some of that resource towards exploring for new ways of doing things. In other words, innovating more, faster, making your fridges better. When you're a government, I think that's a wonderful thing to understand, because if you think the only way to get faster innovation is by pouring public money into research and development, that's a good thing to do, but it's an expensive thing to do. If you understand that you can also speed up innovation by changing the fitness function of parts of the economy, you can do that with regulations which don't cost you anything, that's a wonderful thing to know you can do. That's really powerful. Just briefly give a visual way of thinking about this, if you don't like the one on the previous slide. You can think about the flow of finance through a part of the economy as being like a river. It flows from you, the consumer that buys stuff, through the manufacturer up to the eventual shareholders. And sometimes that can flow like a big, broad river that meanders slowly across the plain. There's nothing getting in its way. It's going very slowly, doesn't have to do any work. What you can do with regulation is divert some of that flow, maybe a part of it, maybe even all of it, but force it down a narrow channel where it has to flow faster and it has to do some work. That's a way of thinking about how you can get that innovation effect. Nobody ever stuck a water wheel bang in the middle of a big broad river that was flowing slowly. Just a brief modeling example from the model that JF and Flemke work with. Here we're simulating different policy options for deploying electric vehicles in India and comparing different policy options, subsidies, taxes, regulations, mandates. And of course, we get slightly different results from this for different countries, not surprisingly. They're at different stages of the transition. They have different car markets. So you don't expect to see the same thing every time. But we did actually see a pattern across these countries that when you compare the policy options, it tends to be the regulatory ones, the efficiency regulations or the zero emission technology mandates. Those are the ones that get you the fastest deployment of the new technology, the fastest emissions reduction, and also the fastest cost reduction of electric vehicles. Subsidies were the next best, and taxes were the worst overall in this occasion. So we've done investment, we've done regulation. Now I want to talk a bit about tax. And the standard advice, the one that follows from that equilibrium logic that I shared at first, is that you should price carbon according to the social cost of carbon. In other words, the damage done by climate change. And this on the left is a quote from the US White House Council of Economic Advisors, where they were refreshing their estimate for the social cost of carbon and changing it from $36 a ton of CO2 to $37 a ton. And they said that they'd done this, developed over many years using the best science available, rigorous evaluation of costs and benefits, and so on. Actually, what was the best science available saying at exactly the same time, November 2013, the best science available was saying that unless you come up with a parameter representing willingness to pay to avoid human extinction, then social cost of carbon estimates can be unboundedly high. In other words, somewhere between 0 and infinity. So as a policymaker, that's not a hugely useful guide. I should set my carbon price somewhere between 0 and infinity. Okay. How else could we think about this? Well, maybe we should realize that in the ecosystem economy, there's no such thing as absolute value. What something is worth depends on your perspective. What do you want to use it for? What's the context? What do you want? So it's relative value that matters, not absolute value. And in terms of the low carbon transition, the relative value of competing technologies, the relative cost, the relative profitability, the relative price, those are the things that really matter. And you should think about carbon pricing or carbon taxes in those terms. And most of all, can we use it to tip the system from one state to another state? From a state where the fossil system is dominant, where it's dominated by the balancing feedbacks of lock-in to the incumbent system, into a state where it's dominated by the reinforcing feedbacks of clean technology development and diffusion. If we can do that, then we're doing something very useful with the carbon tax or with other policies. And there are two examples. This is from a paper I wrote with Tim Lenton, the first thing we did together on positive tipping points. And we found there are examples of this in the world's fastest power sector transition in the UK and the world's fastest transition to electric vehicles in Norway. In both of those, you could see where a fixed carbon tax or a tax of some kind had helped to cross a threshold. In the UK power system, it made coal become the most expensive source of power, which meant it generated much less often, and it was also much less profitable. In Norway, it was a combination of tax and subsidy that made electric vehicles cheaper to buy than petrol cars. And of course, in both cases, they weren't the only policies. They were part of a package of policies that worked together. But they're quite outstanding examples. That UK one, over a decade, we decarbonized our power sector roughly 8 times faster than the global average. And that Norwegian one, at the point where I made this graph, Norway's EV share of car sales was 20 times the global average. So that's really significant, really useful acceleration. So tax should target tipping points. That's what we should use it for. One thing that follows from that is you don't want the same carbon price all across the economy. Standard theory says you do, but why? Standard theory says you do because it's thinking in terms of allocative efficiency. It's imagining the economy is fixed and static, and there's a menu of options for decarbonization, and you want to take the cheapest things off the menu first. But that's not what the economy is like. The economy is actually changing. The menu of options is changing, and the prices of the things on the menu are changing. So actually what you want, if you're going to have carbon pricing, is a level that helps you cross the tipping point in each sector. And that's completely different. It's very high in steel, it's lower in cars, it's negative in building energy efficiency, and so on. So if you have the same carbon price across the whole economy, that will be dynamically inefficient. It will be much too high in some sectors and too low in others. It will be ineffective and wasteful at the same time. Another thing that follows from thinking dynamically about carbon pricing is that the two main policy options are not the same. A fixed tax and an emissions trading scheme, which are the two main ways of doing carbon pricing, they're not fundamentally equivalent, as is usually believed. They're fundamentally different in their dynamics. The emissions trading scheme builds in a balancing feedback. What happens if I reduce my emissions, then I reduce demand for emissions permits, but the supply of permits is fixed by the cap, and that means the price will come down. If the price comes down, that means the incentive for you to reduce your emissions has just got less. So if I do more and that reduces the incentive for you to follow, that's a balancing feedback. That's not helpful if we're trying to bring about fast and cost-effective change. And when you put this through an agent-based model, as in this example, it shows that for the same average carbon price over a period of time, the fixed tax gets faster emissions reduction than the cap and trade system. And it actually does it with a lower electricity price in this example. All of that was about individual policies, investment, regulation, and tax. Of course, in real life, we use them together, different packages. And another example of the FTT modeling on electric vehicles, which I particularly liked, showing here what happens when you do combine different policies. And in this kind of disequilibrium system, the sum of policies acting together is not the same as the sum of their individual parts. Their effect in combination is different. It can be more or less than the sum of the parts, which means it's actually quite meaningless to try to attribute the effect of one policy on its own. Or when you're assessing policies, you're deciding what to do, to just take one on its own and say, what's the net present value of this policy and how does it compare to those of others? It's not a meaningful question. What matters is the effect of the policies in combination. Just want to come back, before we leave economics, come back to this point about path dependence. I said before, path dependence means decisions now affect the options that we'll have later. Something else it means as well, which is that the easiest next step doesn't necessarily lead along the easiest path to your destination. And I had a fun with the artist who was drawing these pictures for me, because this really took a few goes to try and get right. And it's probably still not quite as clear as we'd like it to be. But what it's trying to show there is this guy's got two paths he can go down. One of them looks really easy at first, but then it takes a horribly difficult route over the mountains, and he's trying to cross the mountains. The other path, the upper one, looks more difficult at first. It has to go over some foothills, but then after that, it's quite an easy path through. And what's the relevance of that? So in other words, here we're showing the easiest next step is not the one that takes you on the easiest route to cross the mountains. Why is that relevant to the transition? Well, it's the difference between least cost at a moment in time and least cost over the course of time. At a moment in time is the next step. Over the course of time is the pathway through the mountains. And traditionally, equilibrium-based economic thinking has said, do the thing that's least cost at a moment in time, then do it again at the next moment, then again at the next moment, then again and again and again. And it's assumed that that means you'll do the least cost thing over the course of time. But why would you? Because the economy is path dependent, and there's no reason to think that the easiest next step is the easiest path through the mountains. And let's look at a couple of examples. One, in the UK, when we first looked at supporting offshore wind, the first subsidies for it were 4 times the market price of electricity. And not surprisingly, equilibrium-minded economists thought that was a bad idea. One of them, Dieter Helm, who was quoted in The Economist magazine, said offshore wind was among the most expensive ways of marginally reducing carbon emissions known to man. And he was right. It was. But the aim wasn't the marginal reduction of carbon emissions. The aim was structural change and complete elimination of emissions. And it turned out offshore wind was actually quite good at that. When we invested in it, all those reinforcing feedbacks kicked in, it went down the learning curve, the cost fell by 70% within a decade, and it became cheaper to generate electricity from offshore wind than it was from gas. And so now when we sign 15-year fixed price subsidy contracts, it's no longer positive subsidy, it's negative subsidy. When offshore wind generates, it gives back money to the government at the same time, because it can do it a lot more cheaply than the market price. So it turned out that was a wonderful thing to do, and it's lucky we didn't listen too much to all of those economists. Second example, going back to this carbon pricing one, same study, agent-based model, but there's a really interesting finding, which is the emissions trading scheme. It's set up with the purpose of getting least cost marginal change. That's what it does. It's very well defined to do that. It's very successful at that job. What does it lead to? not only slow emissions reduction and a higher electricity price, as we saw in the previous slide, but also larger wasted investment. There's a whole load of investment that goes into new coal plants that will then have to be taken away again before the end of the transition. It's like spending a lot of money on doing up a building before you demolish it. That's pointless. And in this example, it's a very old study, which is why it's got a slightly unusual looking technology mix, not the one that we'd shown now. But the tax leads to significantly less wasted investment because it doesn't optimize so effectively for least cost marginal change. So just zooming out to how do you approach a transition altogether? I actually made this slide for a talk last week to the Climate Change Committee, because one of the main things they do is advise the government on carbon budgets and track progress against them. And there's a big risk that if you're thinking that way, you end up doing the wrong thing. If you're thinking about how do I reduce emissions for the next carbon budget, the next short-term period, how do I do that at the least cost way? Well, you're prioritizing least cost marginal change, and you're probably not going to achieve least cost structural change. And what happens in practice is, at first, nothing. There's a bit of carbon pricing or some other weak policies, nothing changes. Costs are just absorbed, as they easily can be by an incumbent system. Second, the incumbent fossil fuel systems are incentivized to operate more efficiently. That's what we've had in the energy-intensive industries in Europe for the last 20 years or so. We've pushed them to operate more efficiently. Then you get to a point you're trying to reduce emissions further and you can't do it just through efficiency. What do you do next? Well, the next cheapest thing is to start burning some biofuels. So you chuck them in instead of the fossil fuels. And that gets you a bit further down the emissions curve. Then you get to a point where that's not good enough anymore because there aren't enough genuinely sustainable biofuels and they can't go around. You've got to do some more. Then what do you do? Well, the risk is, having got that far, you've done nothing to develop the alternatives. There are no readily available, affordable zero-emission solutions. So then your choices are you bust your carbon budgets, you close down, or you relocate overseas. And that's a sort of exaggerated example to make the point, but that's what can happen, or at least some of that can happen. What do we want instead? Well, instead of a process where each step delays the necessary, we want an approach where each step enables the next. And instead of thinking primarily about the emissions line that we want to achieve, we should be thinking about the deployment line, the S-curve, and how do we get up it. So you're thinking in terms of zero emission solution market share. And every sector is different, every transition is different, but you can see a pattern. They tend to move through this process of R&D at the beginning, public procurement to do the first deployment, subsidies to help, again, get the first deployment of the new technology and gradually scale it up, then regulations or mandates to force it much more quickly to spread through markets and society, and then on to wider infrastructure investment and whatever else you need to do to reconfigure the systems and embed it in society and deal with its consequences. That's the pattern we have to move through. Along the bottom, I just put rough indicative, what is the cost per ton of emissions reduction at these different stages? Well, it's probably very high early on because the new things are expensive at first. It's probably very low in that middle stage when you're on the steepest part of the S-curve because you can do a little, like have a regulation or a mandate that doesn't cost you much and get massive, massive deployment of the new zero emission technology. And then it's probably high again in the late stage because then you're not really doing things that reduce a lot of emissions and you're already close to market saturation, but there's still really important things that you have to do. So actually, you know, at that stage and at most of these stages, the cost per ton of emissions reduction is not very relevant. It's actually not a useful metric and it's not what you should be focused on. This is the last slide I'll show on economics, and it's a hopeful one. You could say we're winning. This is from a study that looked at publications by 6 major international organizations, and it tracked their use of different phrases, different concepts. some like market failure, which were clearly part of the neoclassical school of thought, and others that they labeled as Keynesian Schumpeterian. Everything that I've just been saying would fall into the Keynesian Schumpeterian bracket, or you could equally call it complexity or evolutionary. And they also looked at a limits to growth paradigm, the red line. And they show here that there is change over time, that the neoclassical one, which was pretty unchallenged at first, is now being quite consistently challenged by the Keynesian Schumpeterian school of thought. So I think that's very hopeful. But what this is showing is a gradual change in the discourse. There's still a long way to go to actually back this up with all the right analysis that fits with this disequilibrium way of thinking about the economy, and to get that really fully, deeply embedded, not only into government's decision-making processes, but also into people's mindsets. There's a massively long way to go. So, part 2, diplomacy. I'm a bit behind time, aren't I? Shall I be quick on diplomacy?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be really fast.
We said overrun a bit, so the road is over 2 hours.
Okay, I'll be really fast on diplomacy. So this follows from the economics. There's a connection. If you think that decarbonisation only gets more difficult, it's like pushing a rock up a hill, and Sisyphus and Hades, the rock comes back down to the same bloody place every time. That's actually how Nordhaus's model of climate change and the transition is constructed. There's no permanent change. You're always back to your starting point. But luckily, the real world isn't like that. And it's more like a hill that does have a top. You have to do that sequence of policies that I showed before, but you can push the rock over the top. And the place where you end up is better than where you started. You're in a clean economy that is not only not wrecking the climate, but it's generally cheaper and better. So that's hopeful. That changes the paradigm of climate change diplomacy. In your fixed economy, then diplomacy is all about how do you divide up the pie of the finite global carbon budget. And if you think that's a costly thing to do, that's a negative sum game. It's extremely hard to negotiate. But if actually we're moving somewhere better than where we started, then there's a positive sum game. And it's the game of how do we work together to accelerate up the S-curve in each sector. And when you start thinking in that way, you realize there are lots of coordination gains. There's faster innovation, there's larger economies of scale, there's level playing fields where you need them, all those kind of things that you can get through working together. But how do you get them? You have to change the structure of diplomacy in 3 ways, which I'll go through very briefly. One is you have to break it down by sector. You cannot negotiate over global emissions. That's far too broad. Each sector is totally different from the others. Agriculture is not the same as industry, transport, cars are not the same as planes. Each of these has different technologies, different obstacles to overcome, different international connections. So you have to chop it up, think about each of those systems differently, make each one the focus of its own discrete international cooperation. Second thing is you need to work with a smaller group of countries in each sector. If you have 197 countries around the table, as we have had in multilateral climate diplomacy for the last 30 years, then your lowest common denominator is as low as it can possibly be. So you've got maximum breadth, minimum depth. So it's very good for norm setting, for agreeing on your goals, like limit climate change to 2 degrees, but it's kind of hopeless for agreeing anything substantive. And we have to agree some substantive things if we're going to change the global economy 5 times faster this decade than we did in the last 2. The good news is in each of the emitting sectors, typically the top 10 countries account for about 3/4 of global production or consumption. And it will be a different set of countries in each sector. So that's good. It means you haven't got quite so many people that need to agree on everything. I'll skip that for the sake of time. Third thing is, in terms of timing, we've focused forever in climate diplomacy on long-term targets. That's been the obsession, the mid-century goals or the next decade goals and all the rest. There's a problem with that. There are 2 problems. One is governments are uncertain about what they can achieve in the future. They're much more confident. They know what they can do in the present. The other is that early in the transition, there are not very strong interests in the transition. When it's very early, almost by definition, not many people want it to succeed. But as the transition progresses, more people have an interest in it progressing further. So my example of that is China. In 2008, China set itself a target of deploying 1.8 gigawatts of solar power by 2020. When it got to 2020, it deployed 253 gigawatts of solar power, 140 times as much. What happened along the way? Well, one thing is that the cost of solar came down by a very large amount, and that created the interest in deploying solar in China. It brought into play the interest of cheap electricity in China. The other thing that happened was lots of Chinese businesses grew and flogged solar panels to all of the rest of the world, which meant they then had a really strong interest in this transition going ahead. So those two, and probably others as well, built over time. And of course, that helped create a stronger interest as well as a stronger possibility of faster progress. So when you negotiate over long-term targets, you don't have any of that on your side. That's a very weak point of leverage. When you negotiate over current actions, you have much stronger leverage because there's confidence in what can be done now. And anything that you do takes you on this path of building interest and enables you to do more at the next step. So that's much more powerful. So you put those three things together, and it suggests that in the 3D space of climate change diplomacy, then we need to move to an opposite point from where we are now. For the last 30 years, we've focused on long-term targets, economy-wide emissions, and universal participation. And we need to move to sector-specific, plurilateral, action-focused diplomacy. And that would be enormously higher leverage and able to change the global economy much more quickly. I'll skip a bit of a COP26 example and just say one of the things that came out of COP26 was a pretty large group of countries, which now covers about 80% of the global economy, agreeing that they would work together in this way, that they would work together in each sector to try and cross the tipping point where the clean tech became more affordable, accessible, and attractive than the fossil fuels. It's one thing to have a statement, it's something else to make it a reality. This is still very much a work in progress, but this is, in my view, the useful agenda for climate change diplomacy. This is where we need to shift it to over the coming decade to have a chance of winning. And a final point to end on is just to say, one of the most famous things to come out of Exeter University on climate change is probably Tim Lenton's diagrams of the tipping points in the climate system and how they're connected to each other. If you tip one of them, it increases the risks of tipping others. And that's a deeply troubling and frightening thought. But one of the most hopeful things is its analogy in the global economy, that because the different emitting sectors are connected by some shared technologies and some shared infrastructure, there is the possibility also that when you cross a positive tipping point in one of these sectors, it increases the chance of crossing it in others as well. And to me, that gives me hope that moving 5 times faster may in fact be possible. So I'll end there. I put up the web reference because there's a bunch of sources and things, everything that I've talked about, there's links to it all online. Stop there. Thanks.
We've got time for questions. There'll also be tea and coffee arriving about 5 minutes for after the lecture. Already arrived. It's already arrived. Perfect. Let's start with questions.
And you spoke about the need for more of a long-term vision when it comes to climate change adjustments and the need for structural change in the UK government context. What are the practical ways you think we can get structural change to move faster?
So just for the online audience, we might use the role where we
So thank you. Yeah, the question there was about how can we make structural change happen more quickly? Well, boiling down what I was saying on all of the economic stuff, really, if you want to really simplify it, then the first thing is in each sector, having identified a zero emission solution, you need to create its first market. And subsidy or public procurement are two very, very good ways of doing that. So that's what we should do first in each sector, make sure that we've created a first market for deploying the zero emission solution. After that, one of the most effective things to do is to regulate, to spread it quickly through markets. Great example of that is the zero emission vehicle mandate, which says each year, this percent of the cars that you sell, car firms, must be zero emission. And that's on a rising trajectory, and you stick that up to 100% by the year when you want to meet it. That's extremely effective. You can't just do that on its own. Alongside that, you need to be investing in the infrastructure, and there's all kinds of other policies you can do. Each sector is different, so it's difficult to generalize, but it's this pattern of first invest in the new, regulate for its spread, use the full range of policy instruments, think about infrastructure, think about skills, all of that stuff. Tax, yes, think about that too, use it when you can, but not only that, use it all together. That's how you get fast structural change.
I can just say loudly if you like.
I think the online audience will be able to hear.
Actually repeat the question. Well, it's with me now. Thank you. Thanks very much. Really, really interesting talk, Simon. Thank you. I found it really, really persuasive, but I guess for me, my question is about leverage points, and in particular about structural impediments to change that reflect unequal dynamics of power and wealth and so forth. So I think, the ideas and the sort of program you're setting out is super, super persuasive, but it's how do you, I think for me, a lot of the problem here in this space is not about the persuasiveness of ideas, but embedded power hierarchies and power structures. And that includes in amongst policymakers and governance structures at the national level, the biggest institutions in the world, like IMF and so forth. So that for me is my question. It's around how do you, where are those leverage points and how do you engage with them or I guess break them?
Thank you. Well, look, I totally agree. Power structures are enormously important. They're part of this, and we have to think about how do we engage with them. One of the ones that people most often think about is the power of the fossil fuel industry, a huge set of vested interests that lobby politics and all the rest of it. To me, the thing that is the most important principle in how you address that is that the leverage is not on the supply side, it's on the demand side. What I mean by that is the leverage is not in going after the fossil fuel industry and saying, please, Shell or BP, have a good transition plan. I don't care if they do or don't. I really don't care. The horse saddle manufacturers didn't have a great transition plan for the horses to cars transition, didn't stop it happening. I don't care. So it's not that. It's also not the keep it in the ground argument. You probably should keep some of it in the ground because otherwise you're creating stranded assets and someone's going to face a big loss. But again, that's not the fundamental thing. Anybody who owns fossils wants to dig them up and sell them. Those interests are incredibly strong. If you take those interests head on, you will probably lose. But the leverage is on the demand side in the sense that the people who are using the goods and services, the ultimate final use of the energy, don't actually care where it came from. So when you consume electricity, you don't care, or you might, but you don't have to care how it was produced, as long as it's cheap and it's available and it's reliable. So whereas the coal miners really want to keep digging up the coal and selling it, the electricity consumers really don't care, which means there's much more leverage there to change the system. So that example I gave of the UK decarbonising the power sector 8 times faster than the global average, people like us who love working in this field and care about it, we know all kinds of things that have happened. But your average consumer, do they know that we've gone from coal being 40% of the generation mix to 1% and nearly zero? Probably not. Do they know that we've got a fixed carbon tax? Probably not. Do they know that we've got contracts for difference and offshore wind and all that? Probably not. They don't care. So that's the most important principle. Act on the demand side, not on the supply side. I think there's a different set of power structures that you're also alluding to, which is within big organizations like government departments and World Bank and IMF and that kind of thing. Those are really difficult too, and I'm not sure I have any particularly good principle on how you negotiate them. But I would say that ideas are enormously important. When I was in the UK government at one stage, we really wanted the government to do some strong regulation in the building sector. And at that point, the relevant minister said, well, look, I'm really up for having this mission-oriented approach, as we were talking about at the time, as part of our industrial strategy, but I want it to be about innovation, not regulation. And the colleagues of mine who are in our construction sector, who'd worked a construction sector team in the government business department, and they know that sector and they've worked with it for ages, they know that it's a lazy sector. It doesn't innovate. Everybody knows that. It's one of the least innovative sectors in the UK economy. And they know that the only thing that ever forces it to get off its arse and innovate is regulation, which fits with the more theoretical description that I was giving. But it was the impediment in that case was not the vested interest, not the lobbying, it was the ideas.
Thanks so much, Neil Anter here. Nice to see you, Simon. Thank you for that. And I had 4 questions written down, but I'm going to continue along this line about equilibrium and status quo in policymaking because of interests. And it seems so. Again, this is a question, I guess, from your experience in policymaking that, well, certainly in various branches of political science, there is this idea that these vested interests are very intransigent, but there are coalitions that can overcome those. And so advocacy coalitions that actually act together, even if they are unlikely bedfellows, to create change to overcome the blockages from the status quo, as it were. So a lot of those have just been looked at in terms of domestic policymaking, and maybe the building sector is a good example, as you've been alluding to. Do those sorts, but in international policymaking, those actors are assumed just to be countries, so you have to have coalitions of countries to vote and all these sorts of things within UN processes. Can you say a little bit more about this, or your experience about unlikely bedfellows coming together? Because even with the massive, even if you accept the arguments for structural change, there are significant vested interests, as you've just been discussing. So how do you overcome those other than sort of forcing through against those vested interests? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question. So a few thoughts on that. One is, I'm going to refer back to a few slides that are along the way. I'm going to go right back to the beginning for one of them. There it is. When you look back at the historical case studies of transitions that people like Frank Heels write about, then you see that there were lots of different actors that had a role in making them happen, and that either helped them happen when they might not have done, or helped them happen more quickly than they might have done otherwise. And here I was just showing, some of the typical people involved in this. You've got the scientists, the entrepreneurs, the activists, the investors. You can see how they all fit together in this reinforcing feedback. And it doesn't matter which of these you think is most powerful. It really doesn't matter, because each one is doing something that enables the next. One of my favorite examples of the historical case studies is, I think in the write-up, it's called the transition from cesspools to sewers. And some of the critical actors in that were engineers who were developing pipelines that hadn't been had before, doctors who were discovering the link between sewage in the streets and cholera, and early customers, including breweries, which wanted nice, clean water to make their product with, and city governments. And so that's an example of one of these coalitions. It was actually the engineers, the doctors, the brewers, and the city governments together. They helped get that transition off the ground and have its first stage. And eventually, of course, it was national governments that spread that infrastructure to everybody. So bringing it on to climate change, an example, one of the slides I skipped over. Yeah, this was showing a bit of the COP26 coal to clean power campaign. And what we were thinking here at the beginning was there was still about 50 countries in the world planning to build new coal power plants, which is pretty much the worst thing you can do for climate change. And we thought, what does it take to change their minds? What does it take to make each of those countries think, actually, we don't want new coal power, we want some extra clean power capacity instead? How do you make that more attractive to them? And we had a coalition of sorts, you could certainly call it that, which included about 10 donor countries like the UK that were prepared to put some of their international aid money into supporting other countries with things like renewable energy integration and different forms of practical and financial assistance. We have multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that were able to lend money and also be part of these policy conversations with governments. Had expert organizations like the IEA and IRENA. We had philanthropy that was putting up funding. And most interestingly, we also had activists in countries where this kind of thing is possible. In countries like Bangladesh or the Philippines, there were local groups that also understood what the agenda was and what the campaign was and were put on pressure of their own kind. And so it's these kinds of coalitions that I think we did have some effect. There were about 20 countries that when it got to COP26 committed to no new coal power that hadn't made any such commitment before. There were others that still planned some, but they significantly scaled back their pipeline of new coal plants. So that kind of thing, those kind of coalitions, I think are absolutely the kind of thing we need.
Thank you very much. I'll go to an online question after this question, but first one from the room.
Okay. Yeah, great talk, Simon, as always. You put the picture of 3 politicians earlier who advocate for the carbon tax. With my sort of secondment in Washington, I can probably say why the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, is saying the carbon tax is the best thing to do. And I'm not sure I could say why von der Leyen would be saying that, but the WTO probably as well. And in my view, it's a mix-up in terms of what the institution aims to do and what we think the policy will result in. So the reason why the IMF would say that, it's because it's in the business of lending to countries and is always advocating for raising domestic revenues to essentially the mantra is to reduce the debt to GDP ratio and to essentially expand public finances, public revenues in effect. And so the IMF happily believes that you have this twin goal that wins 2 things in one go, which is to expand public revenue and at the same time reduce emissions. But I think the fact that the tax reduces emissions is actually something that's assumed by the economists. They think this obviously happens. If you tax pollution, the polluter pays, then obviously the emissions are going to go down once you tax it. But I think that their ultimate goal is to raise public revenue, and they have no knowledge really over how much it reduces emissions. But something I discovered in Washington, I suppose, is the degree to which what institutions say is tied to their institutional goal, not necessarily that what they say is what they truly believe will happen. So I wonder if you have that experience as well.
It's a really interesting comment, and I'm sure I'd agree with that. And I think if the IMF has an organizational interest in countries putting up taxes, you could also probably say that the European Commission has an organizational interest in promoting its emissions trading scheme, because it's invested so heavily in that over the years, developing that huge amount of bureaucracy. It really doesn't want to walk away from that and say that was a bad idea. It's not going to work very well. We should do something else instead. It's committed in that sense. So I completely agree. I think so how do you change that? Well, part of the problem is that the economics profession has given them cover. If the economics profession is going around saying carbon pricing is the most efficient way to decarbonize, then the IMF can take advantage of that for its own organizational interests and repeat the point. If the economics profession was saying something different, it would be harder for the IMF to keep saying that. So I think, there are different approaches we can take to changing it, but spreading an evidence-based, theory-based, simulating model-based understanding that other policy options may in fact be the most effective in different contexts, that's an important thing to do, I think.
So we probably have more questions online than we had time for. So I'm going to take two of them together. They're about applying these ideas on smaller scale. So Peter asks whether we can apply it within the university. And they were thinking of having some sort of internal carbon tax on high emission choices like flights and spending that money on lower carbon alternatives. Amanda's asking whether this can be applied to small island states and then particularly the food sector.
Oh, okay. So on the universities question, this is something that is connected to all the ideas of this, which is how do you bring about rapid system change? Well, as we've been talking in this discussion, it's about understanding where is the leverage to create change. And so for me, there's a very general principle, which is if you want to do something to help on climate change as an individual or an organization, or even as a country, then the most important thing to think about is not your footprint, it's your point of leverage. What is it that you can do better than most people can do to bring about system change? That's the most important thing, because system change doesn't happen by itself. It's not somehow happening in a different universe from the universe where individual people do individual things. System change only happens because people do stuff. So what can you do to make it come about? Well, it must be to do with what are you best at? If you're a university, your real leverage is in what do you research and what do you teach. That's what you're really good at as a university. So that's the most important thing to think about. So if I was in Exeter University and I wanted Exeter University to be even better than it already is being helpful on climate change, then I would be focused on those things. What is it researching and what is it teaching? And, for example, outside the core courses like this one that are focused on climate change and the transition, what's being taught in all the other ones? In the courses on architecture, are they teaching people how to design zero-emission buildings? I hope so, but who knows? That's the kind of thing I would focus on, not are people in the university getting flights and whatever. I think that's small stuff. Small island states and agriculture. Well, briefly, agriculture, yep, it's been through transitions before. And there were policies used that fit that kind of pattern that I described. It's more complicated, it's more difficult, it has a lot to do with practices and not just technologies, but still there's no reason why you can't apply the same principles. So if the debate is all about carbon pricing of agriculture, then that's not a very good way to start. We should be saying, okay, let's look at the different components of agriculture emissions. What solutions could replace those GHG emitting practices or technologies? And how do we get those into markets? How do we improve them? And how do we spread them? So it's that same kind of thinking. On Well, small island states, I suppose, go back, I'm not sure if this is addressing the question, I hope it is, but go back to that distinction between footprint and leverage. Small island states have virtually no carbon footprint, so don't worry about that. But do they have leverage? Well, yes, they have some. One that everybody knows about is they have an authoritative voice in climate change diplomacy. People recognize them as speaking authentically. And I think it matters enormously. What are they saying to the world about the structure of climate change diplomacy? Are they just saying to everybody, you must raise ambition, you must have stronger NDCs, you must have better 2050 targets? Because that's what most of the climate change community is saying and has been saying for a long time. In my view, if that's what they keep saying, they're not using their point of leverage to very good effect. Whereas if they say to people, come on, guys, let's look at what's worked for diplomacy in any other field where it has ever worked, successful peace agreements, trade agreements, nuclear non-proliferation, all kinds of things where diplomacy has done something useful. How has that happened? And how does that interact with what we know about how transitions happen? Okay, it means we need to change the structure of climate diplomacy to make it sector-specific, plurilateral, and action-focused. If they were saying that, that would be powerful. A lot of other people would come on board with that much more quickly. So I think they do have leverage.
Amazing, thanks. That draws this seminar to a close. For people that have a bit of time left, we have a bit of coffee and tea, so you can ask a few more questions. Thank you very much for coming to Exeter. It was lovely again.
I'll just look at the.
Can I get my USB?
Yes, if you want to check that for you. I'll adjust.